It started like any other day in the heart of Ohio. The air was crisp, the sun barely peeking through the clouds, and JD Vance, the senator known for his no-nonsense approach, was walking through a quiet neighborhood. He wasn't there for a political rally or a press conference, just a simple visit to his hometown, a place that still held his roots. Dressed casually, Vance didn't have an entourage, no security details shadowing his every move. He was alone, walking with a purpose, yet with the ease of someone comfortable in his surroundings. It was the kind of day where no one would have expected a moment to unfold, one that would send ripples through the internet, shocking everyone who saw it. A small café sat on the corner of the street. It wasn't a fancy establishment, just the kind of place where locals gathered, where people knew each other's names, and where a cup of coffee still cost less than a gallon of gas. Vance, seemingly lost in thought, slowed his pace as he approached the door. He had no idea that just outside, a security camera perched on the side of the building was rolling, capturing everything. A moment that wasn't planned, wasn't staged, just pure, unscripted reality. As he pulled the door open, the soft jingle of the bell overhead announced his arrival. The cafe was quiet, a few people scattered around, sipping coffee, reading newspapers, chatting about the latest news. But then, something caught Vance's attention. Near the counter, a man stood with his head down. He wasn't just any man. His clothes were ragged, his shoes worn thin. The look of exhaustion on his face told a story no words could fully capture. He clutched a few crumpled dollar bills in his hand, his fingers trembling slightly. The cashier, a young woman in her 20s, looked at him with sympathy but also uncertainty. "Sir, I'm sorry," she said softly. "You don't have enough." The man swallowed hard. He had been hoping to buy something warm, something to fill his stomach, even if just for a few hours. But it wasn't enough. And now, he was standing there, defeated, debating whether to walk away or plead for a little more kindness. JD. Vance watched the scene unfold, his brow furrowing. He wasn't someone who ignored things like this. He had grown up knowing what it meant to struggle, what it felt like to wonder where the next meal would come from. It wasn't a foreign concept to him, it was personal. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, placing a hand gently on the man's shoulder. The man turned, startled, his tired eyes meeting Vance's. "Hey," Vance said, his voice calm. "Why don't you let me take care of that for you?" The homeless man blinked, clearly unsure how to respond. "You don't have to do that," he murmured, but his voice held the weight of gratitude. "I know," Vance replied, pulling out his wallet. "But I want to." He handed the cashier a bill, more than enough to cover the meal. "And get him whatever he wants," he added. "No limits." The young woman behind the counter smiled, nodding as she rang up the order. The man looked at Vance, his lips parting as if to say something, but no words came. He simply reached out, shaking Vance's hand with both of his own, as if holding on to something more than just a handshake. Maybe hope. "Thank you," he finally whispered. Vance smiled. Everyone needs a little help sometimes. The moment was brief, but it carried a weight that was undeniable. And while Vance hadn't realized it at the time, the cafe's security camera had captured everything. Later that evening, as the cafe owner reviewed the footage, he paused, watching the scene play out. It wasn't just another customer helping someone, it was JD Vance, a man known for his policies and strong opinions, doing something completely off camera with no agenda, no press release. The owner hesitated for a moment, then decided to, post the clip online. He didn't add any flashy captions, just a simple message: kindness needs no spotlight. Within hours, the video spread like wildfire. Social media platforms lit up with comments, reactions, and debates. Some people were amazed, others skeptical, but one thing was clear: JD Vance had no idea he had been recorded, and that made the moment even more powerful. News outlets picked up the story, discussing what had happened. Some framed it as an example of genuine compassion. Others debated whether more politicians should follow suit. But for Vance, none of that mattered. When someone showed him the video, he looked at it, shook his head with a small smile, and said, "I wasn't doing it for cameras. I was just doing what felt right." That response, more than anything else, cemented the moment. It wasn't about politics, popularity, or headlines. It was about humanity. And sometimes, it's the moments we don't plan, the ones we don't think anyone is watching, that define who we truly are. The conversation around the video only grew from there. People from all walks of life chimed in with their thoughts. Some praised Vance for his quiet act of kindness, while others speculated on whether it was a mere coincidence or an insight into the kind of leader he truly was. At the cafe, the young cashier found herself answering questions from curious customers. Was he really just walking in off the street? Did he seem to know the man? She would nod, her voice unwavering. He had no idea the camera was on him. He just saw someone in need and stepped up. That's all there was to it. The homeless man, whose name was later revealed to be Greg, also found himself at the center of attention. Reporters tried to track him down, hoping to get his side of the story. At first, Greg was hesitant. He wasn't used to people asking about him, much less caring. But when he finally spoke, his words were simple yet profound. "I've had a rough time," he admitted. "Most days, people just walk past me like I don't exist. But that man, he looked at me like I mattered. That meant more than anything." Greg's story resonated with people. He had once worked as a mechanic but lost his job during a downturn. One bad break led to another, and before he knew it, he was living on the streets, scraping by however he could. He wasn't looking for handouts, just a little dignity, a little kindness. Vance, for his part, didn't make any public statements about what happened. He continued his work as usual, fielding policy discussions, speaking at events, and handling the responsibilities of his role. But everywhere he went, people brought up the video. Some thanked him, some questioned him, and some simply wanted to know what had been going through his mind at that moment. His answer was always the same. "I didn't think about it. I just did what any decent person should do." But the story didn't end there. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. A group of volunteers, inspired by the video, came together and started a small initiative. They began handing out meals to the homeless in that very same neighborhood. The cafe even joined in, offering free coffee and breakfast to those in need. It was a ripple effect, one act of kindness leading to another, then another. And Greg, his life took a turn he never saw coming. A local business owner, moved by the story, offered him a job at an auto repair shop. It wasn't charity, it was an opportunity. A second chance. "I just needed someone to see me," Greg said as he accepted the offer. Vance eventually heard about what had unfolded. He didn't take credit for it. He didn't turn it into a campaign talking point. He simply smiled and said, "That's what America is about, looking out for each other." In the end, the story wasn't just about JD Vance. It wasn't just about Greg. It was about the power of small moments, the ones we don't plan, the ones we don't think anyone is watching. Because sometimes, the greatest impact comes from the simplest gestures. And sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones we tell about ourselves, but the ones others tell about us. The momentum from that single act of kindness didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, spreading far beyond Ohio. Across the country, people who had seen the video were inspired to take action in their own communities. Churches, small businesses, and even individuals started paying for meals at local diners, leaving notes that simply read, "Pass it on." A movement had begun, not because of politics, not because of a viral trend, but because one man had chosen to help another without expecting anything in return. Journalists continued to ask JD Vance about the video, hoping for a deeper insight, but he remained steadfast in his response. "It was never supposed to be a story," he would say. "It was just the right thing to do." But the story refused to fade. One evening, a national news network invited Greg to share his perspective. Dressed in clean clothes, his hair freshly cut, he sat in the studio under bright lights, a stark contrast to where he had been just weeks before. When the interviewer asked what he would say to JD Vance if he were watching, Greg took a deep breath before answering. "I'd tell him that moment saved my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not because of the food, not because of the money, but because he made me feel human again." His words struck a chord with millions. The idea that dignity, more than anything, was what so many struggling people needed turned the conversation toward something deeper. This wasn't just about handouts. It was about recognition, about reminding people that they weren't invisible. JD Vance, watching the interview from home, exhaled deeply. He hadn't done what he did for praise, yet the impact was undeniable. But the part that mattered most to him wasn't the attention. It was the fact that Greg had gotten another chance. That was what truly counted. Weeks later, Vance returned to that same cafe. The owner greeted him with a knowing smile. "You changed things around here," he said. Vance shook his head. "No, I didn't. People change things, I just bought a meal." The owner chuckled. "Well, that meal turned into a whole lot more." Sitting down at his usual table, Vance ordered a black coffee and glanced toward the counter. Greg was there, not as a customer this time, but as a man with a job, helping repair a loose fixture near the register. For a moment, their eyes met. Greg grinned. Vance nodded. No words were needed, because some stories don't need an ending. Some stories just keep going, carried forward by the people they touch. And sometimes the smallest act of... As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the story of JD Vance and Greg continued to ripple through communities. The cafe became somewhat of a landmark, not because it was famous, but because it represented something rare in today's world, a simple, unplanned moment of humanity. People who had never set foot in that little shop now traveled just to see the place where it all happened. They weren't coming to take pictures or chase a viral trend. They were coming to experience what the cafe had become, a beacon of kindness. Greg's transformation was one of the most remarkable parts of it all. After starting his job at the auto shop, he worked hard, proving himself every day. The shop owner, impressed with his dedication, eventually promoted him to a full-time position. For the first time in years, Greg had a stable income. He found a small apartment, nothing fancy, but it was his. He no longer had to worry about where he would sleep at night or whether he'd go hungry the next day.
He started reconnecting with family members he had lost touch with, rebuilding bridges that had long been broken. One evening, as he closed up the shop, he noticed something. Across the street, a man sat on the curb, his head hanging low, his
clothes ragged, just like Greg had been not too long ago. Greg didn't hesitate. He walked across the street and sat beside him. "Rough day?" he asked. The man barely lifted his head. "Rough year," he muttered. Greg nodded, understanding. All too well. "You hungry?" The man looked up, eyes wary, as if he had heard that question before, but never trusted the intent behind it. Greg smiled. "Come on," he said. "I know a place." He took the man back to the cafe, sat him down at a table, and ordered him a meal, just like JD Vance had done for him. The cafe owner noticed and gave Greg a knowing look. Paying it forward? Greg grinned. Seems like the right thing to do. Word of what Greg had done reached JD Vance. When he heard about it, he simply shook his head and smiled. "That's the real story," he told a friend over the phone. "Not what I did, but what came after." And that was the truth. It wasn't just about one act of kindness. It was about the chain reaction it had started. Over the next few months, similar stories popped up everywhere. People helping others, not because they had to, not because there were cameras, but because they wanted to. Because they saw someone struggling and decided to do something about it. One day, Greg received a letter in the mail. The sender, JD Vance. Inside was a handwritten,
"No, Greg, I hear you've been paying it forward."
"That's what it's all about. Proud of you. Keep going. JD." Greg read the letter twice, then tucked it into his wallet. Not for show, not for bragging rights, but as a reminder. A reminder that a single moment of kindness, one that wasn't supposed to be seen, recorded, or talked about, had changed everything. And it all started with one simple choice: to help someone in need. As time passed, Greg continued his journey of rebuilding his life, but now with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just trying to survive anymore, he was trying to make a difference. Inspired by JD Vance's simple act of kindness, he started volunteering at a local shelter on weekends, helping others who were in the same place he once was. One evening, as he was cleaning up at the shop, a reporter from a local news station showed up. She introduced herself and explained that she had been following his story. "Greg, people all over the country have seen what happened that day at the cafe, but what's even more inspiring is what you've done since. Can I ask, what made you decide to help others?" Greg hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Because someone helped me when I needed it most," he said simply. JD Vance didn't have to stop that day. He could have walked past me like everyone else, but he didn't. And if one act of kindness could change my life, maybe mine could change someone else's. The interview aired that night, and within hours, Greg's story was spreading again. This time, it wasn't just about what JD Vance had done, it was about the power of paying it forward. Vance himself caught wind of the news story while sitting in his office in Washington. A staff member showed him the segment, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of what had happened. It was never about him. It was about the movement of kindness that had followed. One morning, without any press, without any cameras, Vance returned to Ohio and walked into the same cafe where it all started. The owner recognized him immediately and chuckled. "You know, Senator, ever since that day, we've had people leaving extra money at the counter. Some don't even buy anything for themselves. They just want to make sure someone else gets a meal." Vance smiled, nodding. "That's how it should be." Then, just as he was about to sit down, Greg walked in. He stopped mid-step, eyes widening. "Senator?" Vance grinned. "Just JD." Greg shook his head with a laugh, walking over to shake his hand. "I never got to thank you properly." "You don't have to," Vance said. "I've seen what you've been doing. That's thanks enough." They sat and talked for a while, about life, about struggles, about second chances. At one point, Greg admitted, "For a long time I thought my life was over, that I had nothing left to offer. But now, I feel like I have a purpose again." Vance nodded. "That's the thing about life. Sometimes it only takes one person believing in you to turn everything around." As they spoke, a young woman approached their table. She looked nervous but determined. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I just wanted to say, your story really inspired me. I used to think the world was just full of people looking out for themselves. But after seeing what you both did, I want to be better. I want to help people too." Greg and Vance exchanged a glance before Vance responded, "Then start today. You don't have to do anything big, just look for someone who needs a hand." She smiled, nodding, and walked away. And just like that, the ripple effect continued. That day at the cafe had been just another ordinary moment for JD Vance, a simple gesture of kindness. But the truth was, it had become so much more. It became proof that one small act could inspire countless others. That humanity wasn't lost, that people, when given the chance, would choose to lift each other up. And that sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't the ones planned or scripted. They're the ones that happen when nobody's watching, until they are. As JD Vance and Greg sat in the cafe, the reality of their journey settled in. What had begun as a fleeting moment of kindness had sparked a movement, one that neither of them had anticipated. They weren't politicians or activists in that moment. They were just two men, connected by a shared understanding of struggle, redemption, and the impact of doing the right thing when no one is looking. After finishing their coffee, Vance stood up, pulling a few bills from his pocket and handing them to the cashier. "For the next person who needs it," he said with a wink. Greg watched as the cashier smiled, tucking the money into a small glass jar labeled Pay It Forward Fund. The jar was new, something the cafe owner had started after customers kept following JD's example. It was always full, people contributing what they could to help someone else. As they stepped outside, the autumn air was crisp, the sky painted in hues of orange and gold. Greg took a deep breath, looking around at the town that once felt like a place of dead ends but now seemed full of possibility. "Crazy how life works," he said, shaking his head. Vance nodded. "It's never just about where you start. It's about where you decide to go." Greg turned to him. "Where do you think this will go next?" Vance smirked. "I think that's up to you." The weight of those words settled in. Greg wasn't just the recipient of kindness anymore. He was now the one carrying it forward. And he did. Over the next year, Greg's story continued to inspire. He didn't just stop at helping one person. He started organizing community drives, working with shelters and mentoring those trying to get back on their feet. The auto shop owner saw his dedication and eventually helped him enroll in a business course, encouraging him to think bigger. One day, Greg returned to the cafe, not as a customer, but as a business owner. With the support of the community, he had saved up enough money to open a small repair garage just a few blocks away. The sign above the door read, "Second Chances Auto Repair." When JD Vance heard the news, he made a trip back to town. He walked into Greg's shop and found him under the hood of a car, grease on his hands, a genuine smile on his face. "You really did it," Vance said, impressed. Greg wiped his hands on a rag and grinned. "Told you I had a purpose now." Vance looked around the shop, noticing something on the wall, a framed copy of the handwritten note he had sent Greg months ago. "I hear you've been paying it forward. That's what it's all about. Proud of you. Keep going." JD Greg followed his gaze and chuckled. "Had to remind myself where it all started." Vance clapped him on the shoulder. "This is where it continues." And it did. Greg's shop wasn't just about fixing cars. It was about rebuilding lives. He started hiring people who needed a second chance, giving them jobs, training them, and helping them find stability. He never forgot what it felt like to be overlooked, and he made sure no one in his shop ever felt that way again. One day, a young man walked in, his clothes worn, his face etched with uncertainty. Greg saw himself in him. "You hiring?" the young man asked hesitantly. Greg studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You willing to work hard?" "Yes, sir." Greg smiled. "Then let's get you started." At that moment, JD Vance's small, unplanned act of kindness had come full circle. It had created something bigger than either of them could have imagined. And as Greg helped the young man into his new uniform, he couldn't help but think, sometimes all it takes is one person believing in you to change everything. JD Vance hadn't known a camera was recording him that day at the cafe. He hadn't done it for attention, for politics, or for any reason other than the simple belief that helping others is what decent people do. But the real story wasn't in that one act. It was in everything that happened after. Because kindness doesn't end. It keeps moving forward, passed from one hand to the next, creating a legacy far greater than any one person. And it all started with a simple choice: to do the right thing